Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor of Joe Biden, published a essay about 1.5 or 2 months ago in Foreign Affairs, and that essay gives some insights into the thinking and the worldview of these people. And as I said before, at the moment where we don't know who's telling the truth and who's lying, it is even more important to read people in their original and try to understand what these people want us to believe about what the world looks like, because that way at least we can infer how they would like us to understand the world. Not necessarily how they do, but we can try to read between the lines what the texts that they publish mean. So let's look together at this text here, and let's start maybe with a short intro of Jake Sullivan. This guy here, you must have seen him appearing also on TV quite a bit. He is quite a maverick. The guy is 9 years older than me. He's 47 by now. He was born in 1976, and he has been serving, or he's been working for the people in power in Washington ever since 2008. He was working under and with Hillary Clinton, and then he became an advisor to Joe Biden when he was a vice president in 13-14. And he has been in and out of the administration, and he's been serving these people, the neocons, forever. He's himself, of course, also a neocon, but I would argue he belongs to the smartest class. So he's very different from some people who just repeat talking points. He belongs to the group that makes the talking points. So when people talk about, who's running Joe Biden, I am pretty sure that Jake Sullivan is one of the people who's running Joe Biden, and who's coining the phrases that we then hear repeated on CNN and so on, which is why it makes sense to read their sentences in their originals. So, Foreign Affairs, that's this magazine here, in their November-December issue. This magazine comes out every other month, so 6 times a year. And as I said before, it used to carry some of the most important essays in US foreign policy, including George Kennan, which is why everybody is so keen on publishing in this thing, because it means you belong to the top brass of policy analysis and foreign policy making in the United States. And people like Jake Sullivan and officials, they get to basically publish whatever they want, because these journals are very proud of the fact that they're not just mouthpieces, they're literally the publication ground for people in power, right? So they are proud of that. And here we've got the article in question, with the title, "The Sources of American Power, a Foreign Policy for a Changed World." And it is quite interesting that Mr. Sullivan begins basically with an overview that the world is not the same of what it was, and that America should be optimistic about the future. This kind of also sticks out recently, because in the even newer publication that's already out for January 2024, there's another publication by Fareed Zakaria, the CNN host. This is the same publication. This just looks uglier because I don't have access to the proper PDF yet, just the online text. But you see how it is all of the same people, the same group of people, of neocons, of spin people, that are sitting in public media, and that are sitting in the offices of power, behind the people who actually hold power. But I mean, let's put that one aside. And it's interesting that there's more and more of these articles being published right now, trying to tell Americans, don't worry, it's going to be fine. So Fareed Zakaria, he also says that most Americans think their country is in decline, and keeps on writing and saying that, at the end of the day, the most important thing, once you scroll to the very end of his article, is that the United States, above all others, remains uniquely capable and positioned to play the central role in sustaining this international system. As long as America does not lose faith in its own project, the current international order can thrive for decades to come. this is very similar. This is very similar to what Mr. Sullivan tries to convey at the beginning of his essay, that America should be optimistic. We need to come together. The country needs to. I mean, I'm not American, so I cannot say we, but the country has to come together, and then everything will be fine, because overall, overall we're okay. Shattered flag of the United States, just so that foreign policy can make the point clear, right? So what all of these people are saying, the neocons, is this is not what's happening. We're not shattered. We're not shattering. We just need to refocus ourselves, and then we can continue as we've been doing so far. The post-Cold War era, so this is again Sullivan speaking, the post-Cold War era was a period of great change, but the common thread throughout the 1990s and the years after 9/11 was the absence of intense great power competition. And I think here he's right about that. The entire idea that the United States is basically acting alone and can act however it wants, that only came up after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, and this unipolar moment, and Francis Fukuyama, of course, with this idea of now we're done with history, right? I mean, the liberal democracy has won, and there will be liberal democracies everywhere. That idea was quite prevalent for at least 20-25 years. But, and this is interesting, Jake Sullivan, the neocon, says this is over. We're not living in that world anymore. We are now in a multipolar world that works differently. And he immediately brings the article back to what the sources of U.S. Strength are, and of course he attacks his political opponents. With the election of Donald Trump, the United States had a president who believed that its allies were a form of geopolitical welfare. Sorry, that its alliances were a form of geopolitical welfare. The steps he took that damaged those alliances were celebrated by Beijing and Moscow, which correctly saw US alliances as a source of American strength rather than as a liability. It's interesting that he immediately goes to the alliance system, because I would say it's true that the many alliances the US has, and it's 750 or so bases abroad, and that doesn't even count the small and little outposts where the US military is stationed, that those are the source of US hard power, and that the ability of the United States to coerce its allies into doing its bidding, to the point where somebody can blow up really important infrastructure of a key ally, like a underwater gas pipeline, and everybody just shuts up about it because everybody knows who did it or on whose behalf it was done. That kind of power, that is really central. It's at the heart of US empire and hegemony. And the fact that Sullivan admits that, the fact that he also talks about this core centerpiece of current US strategy, tells me that Mr. Sullivan very much is a realist and not one of those kind of liberal democracy people, at least not in his true self. I mean, he sees power for what it is. Then the essay continues with a little bit of talking points. So, the difficult thing about these essays is to take apart what is just there, what gives us insight into the actual thinking of the person, what is a spin, what is a lie, and what is garnish. So here's an example for some garnishing, right? The way that you decorate a plate prettily when you do fine dining in the evening. This task was brought into stark relief by Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. For 2 years, we've had the same phraseology: unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. It doesn't suffice to say the invasion of Ukraine or the Russia's war against Ukraine. It must be unprovoked, right? Unprovoked is a very important adjective. So that's the garnish. As well as by China's increasing assertiveness in the South China Sea. This is the other garnish, because for the last 10 years, I recall that the hawks and the neocons in Washington and Tokyo, whenever they talk about China, they always introduce China with this adjective of increasingly assertive, just because you need to massage it into the brains of your readers again and again, because repetition is key. Repetition is key to propaganda. So massage it in again and again that China is increasingly assertive. I mean, the way that China has increased its assertiveness, I mean, its assertiveness by now must be in the already have surpassed the moon. It has been increasing so much over the last 10 years. Wow. But okay, this is the garnish. The essence of President Biden's foreign policy is to lay a new foundation of American strengths so that the country is best positioned to shape the new era in a way that protects its interests and values and advances a common good. This is a very realist sentence in the way that it obviously shows that Mr. Sullivan seems to be thinking or seems to want to push his readers toward a conception of a United States that can set the agenda and that can force all of us to obey by its will, which is not the same as creating a liberal system of equal states that have equal say in global affairs, and everybody listens to each other. That's not the idea. The idea is to create an America that can lead or that can course through strength. It's also interesting because I would think that somebody like him must understand also the ways of thinking and the way threat is being perceived, let's say by the Russians or by the Chinese, unless he utterly lacks all forms of strategic empathy. But that would surprise me. The US, he then goes and discusses a little bit the basis for US strength, which he locates, not in its ideology, not in its glorious past, but in its economy. The US economy developed worrying vulnerabilities, while at an aggregated level it thrived. Under the surface, whole communities were hollowed out. So why I'm emphasizing this is that, if he was an idealist, if Sullivan was a person who believed, in the power of emotion or the power of goodness or whatever it is, he would go into the foundations of the United States and how it's built on principles of freedom and blah 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 blah. He doesn't go into that. He immediately connects the economic power with political power on the world stage, and he even accepts that there were mistakes were made in the past when the industrial base was basically cut away, and that is something that a lot of Americans are actually experiencing, right? The entire Rust Belt is this problem that what used to be the backbone of US industrial strength now has been basically outsourced out of the United States under neoliberal thinking, right? Let the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and the Bangladeshi produce all of our goods, and then we just consume them, and we only deliver the blueprints. And Sullivan obviously doesn't agree with this neoliberal strategy. So he says the Biden administration, and whenever he says Biden administration, he means his own guidance, right? Under my guidance, we have enacted the most far-reaching new investments in decades, including the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. We are promoting new breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, clean energy, and semiconductors, while protecting the United States' advantages and security through new export controls and investment rules in partnership with allies. All of these things, they're true. And all of these things are protectionist measures. It's especially the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS Act. Those are protectionist policies in order to make sure that the United States can develop these sectors more thoroughly at home within its own borders, and that its companies do not develop important parts like labor intensive parts outside of its borders. And yeah, well, especially this last sentence, semiconductor, about the semiconductors, while protecting the United States advantages and security. I've said that before, but whenever the United the US or the neocons want to justify not following market liberal principles, they always use national security as a reason, right? You can use the word national security interchangeable with what's good for us. And then you get basically you get the idea that Sullivan obviously sees the economic backbone of the United States as having a serious problem, and you need to bring back more of it back home, which is in direct contrast to these former neoliberal policies, right? When this administration took office, we found that although the US military is strongest in the world, its industrial base suffered from a series of unaddressed vulnerabilities. Yeah, it did. We're investing in US nuclear deterrent to ensure its continued effectiveness as competitors build up their arsenals while signaling openness to future arms control negotiations if competitors are interested. Well, I mean, here you're just excusing building more nuclear weapons, right? And renewing the U.S. nuclear arsenal. And the last point is really just a little bit of window dressing. Oh, by the way, we would engage in nuclear disarmament talks if just those evil other powers were willing to talk to us. But obviously they're not. Therefore, we have to make our own nuclear weapons. And this is such a classic kind of security dilemma. I mean, you both all powers, the Russians and the Chinese, are just going to up their nuclear weapons, and then each one's going to point at the other one for the reason why you have to up your weapons. And well, this is just Mr. Sullivan saying, like, well, obviously we need nuclear weapons because that's the only thing that keeps us safe, and then blame it on the others, right? We only create nuclear weapons because the others are so evil. So this is it's not lying. I don't believe that he's afraid of the others. I don't believe that he really thinks that the problem that you don't have nuclear weapons is other states. Of course, this is what you want because you believe yourself that this is what you need. The other one is just an excuse. In a more competitive world, there can be no doubt that Washington needs to break down the barrier between domestic and foreign policy, and that major public investments are an essential component of foreign policy. And you already see how the argument is being built up that investments into the nation, in breach of WTO rules, like World Trade Organization rules, in breach of a lot of treaties that it has with other states, that are not free market oriented policies, investment policies, that those are national security policies. Because again, in the United States, national security is the overriding principle that wins against all other considerations because it means strengthening hard power of the US. So the argument here is that domestic policy must be subordinated to international, to foreign policy, and be done for the purpose of strengthening US foreign policy, not for the benefit of the people. I want to point this out. This is also something Zakaria in his article gets absolutely wrong. Let me show you this just very quickly. Zakaria writes that a lot of people are worried about the United States and being a declining power and having less money and blah, blah, blah. But despite all the talks of American dysfunction and decay, the reality is quite different, especially when compared with other rich countries. In the 1990s, the United States per capita income measured in terms of purchasing power was 17% higher than that of Japan, 24% higher than Western Europe's. Today, it's 54% and 32% higher, respectively. This doesn't need to bother you. The point is that Zakaria talks about how well the US economy is doing, how the US economy is booming and is so awesome, but he completely, utterly fails to mention that it is not delivering for low and middle income, for the low and middle income class, that it basically only benefits people who already have a lot of money, who are already part of the creme de la creme. And Sullivan, in a sense, does the same. He says, he says, we have a problem with our economy, but the problem is not that a lot of people don't get anything, that a lot of people are poor, and that a lot of people are suffering. He says the problem is that we have hollowed out the industrial base, so we cannot produce enough stuff at home that we would need for our military and so on, and to be a strong, militarily strong nation. It just shows the mindset of neocons, which are not concerned with the well-being of people. They're concerned with the well-being of the military and of their ability to impose. So well-being of the state is well-being of the ability to impose. The United States alliance of partnership with other democracies have been its greatest internal advantage. They helped create a freer and more stable world. And now we're entering again, not fantasy land, but we're entering window dressing land. Not so much a garnish. I mean, this is important. This is a core message that the neocons need to drive home, because they still need to convince you and me of the morality of their proposal, right? And the morality of the proposal, why do we need a strong state? Why does the West need strong militaries and be able to intervene in any place in the world and reign with impunity? Well, because that impunity is actually for the benefit of everybody, because they help to create a freer and more stable world, freedom, stability, virtue signaling, right? But what I do think, where I do think he's not lying, is that he does think the United States alliances and partnerships with other democracies have been its greatest international advantage. They are an advantage. This alliance system is again, as the title of his essay says, a basis of power, backbone of power. So I think that one is absolutely correct. We have mobilized a global coalition of countries to support Ukraine as it defends itself against the, again, unprovoked war of aggression, right? Also showing how far this power is going. NATO has expanded to include Finland, soon to be followed by Sweden, two historically non-allied nations. I find this phrase also interesting, because he doesn't suggest that Sweden and Finland joined NATO because they felt threatened or anything. He phrases it as NATO has expanded to include Finland, which is precisely what Mr. Putin is saying, or has been saying, right? The Russians never said, oh, the Poles and the Hungarians, they chose to join NATO. They always speak about NATO expanding, and this is something that at the early stages of the war, like neocons and especially the propagandists have been pushing against. No, it's the choice of these countries. But we see that even within the Biden administration, there is these hardcore neocon realists like Sullivan, who see the world in the same way, that they managed to expand. And I'm pretty sure they're very proud of that, right? They managed to capture Sweden and Finland and finally get them into the boat. So it's an expansionary move, and not one to defend these countries. Is one that can be used for offensive purpose in the future. And then he goes on talking about how awesome this alliance building has been working over his tenure, because this is halfway a sales pitch. It's not just strategy for the future, it's also all of the cool things we have done. It basically reads like a Apple kind of presentation at the end of the year, all of the cool things we have developed, right? And here Sullivan goes like, we have developed cool new alliances in Asia, with Australia, United Kingdom, and United States, kind of triple alliance, new agreements, based stationing agreements with the Philippines, really great deal with Hanoi, and an agreement with Australia, India, and Japan. He's very proud of the fact that the US was able to pull in more allies left and right? Because this is obviously what he deems, as he says, the really cornerstone of US power. This is another one: India, Israel, the United States, and the United Arab Emirates. Although these partners are all partners in very different ways, but what the US is doing, and what he's admitting here, is he creates a web, a network, a web of different forms of alliances, trying to entangle these other states to tag along with the US. The United States' closest partners are fellow democracies, and we will work vigorously to defend democracy across the globe. except for all the partners that aren't, like Saudi Arabia, a state that still beheads about 60 people a year, for Pakistan, that just overthrew its democratically elected leader. Ukraine, which said there's not going to be any democratic elections in 2024, as there should be. All the partners of the United States are democracies, except for the ones who are not. The good thing about Sullivan is he could actually halfway admit to that, because in the next paragraph we read that Washington's vision of a free, open, prosperous, and secure world is broad and powerful, and it includes those with diverse political systems. Ooh. So now it's diverse political systems, not just democracies. Okay. We will work with any country prepared to stand up for the principles of the UN Charter, even as we shore up transparent and accountable governance and support democratic reforms and human rights defenders. This paragraph is beautiful, because he basically says, I know that the whole democracy and human rights discourse that I'm giving here is basically BS, because at the end of the day we work with anyone who helps us. My enemy's enemy is my friend. I don't care if that guy is a democracy or an autocracy, as long as it helps my interests, US interests, to prosper. We're going to work with them. Actually makes me a little bit hopeful, because it means that at least Sullivan doesn't believe this BS that has been coming out of the US for a long time, right? In the propaganda. I mean, this guy sees the world probably for what it is. He just still has the necessity to kind of make it look pretty. The United States is asking its allies to step up, while also offering more itself. Roughly 20 NATO countries are on track to meet the target spending 2% of their GDP on defense in 2024. Yeah. Again, the US at the moment would like everybody to spend more on weapons and on war. I mean, that's the neocon drumbeat, right? More war. And here he's happy that you get toward more spending. Although, Mr. Sullivan, you must know yourself that you have a problem now, because a lot of US countries are actually going into recession. And there's two ways of getting to hitting the 2% target, right? Because it's measured in per GDP. It's either spend more or your GDP goes down. So we might well see the point where all NATO members meet their 2% GDP target, but that's because GDP went down while the nominal amount that they spend on the militaries remains the same, because those military budgets tend to be fixed. But okay, we will see how that will go. It's a stupid measurement. It's a dumb measurement, and it doesn't really tell us very much about who contributes how much to the alliance. But let's leave this aside. We would also need to up our game and offer the world, especially the global south, a better value proposition. So this is under a better deal, the subheading, where he agrees that, well, a good part of the world is actually not an ally of the United States and has been trying to remain aloof of these advances of the US to tell them, look, I want to coerce you too into an alliance. For these countries, the complaint is not that there is too much America, but too little. Really? Yes, they say, we see the pitfalls of getting closer to major authoritarian powers, but where is your alternative? So in this passage, he has the problem that he needs to explain why is it that a lot of countries don't want to tag along. Why is it that India is still not on board when it comes to the collective West's phrasing and viewing of the war in Ukraine? How is it that Africa and Asian countries and South American countries just don't want to do the same thing that the US wants to do? And why do they vote against the United States consistently at the UN? And this, to me, again, is more of kind of finding an excuse that he must see himself, and he knows it. He shows it later on in the essay, that just what the US tries to do is not in the interest of a lot of these countries, and this is obvious to them. That's why they don't play along. But he kind of needs to formulate it in a way that says, look, we just need to do a little bit more for them, right? But if we go down here, This is quite interesting. The administration will continue to try to reform the World Trade Organization, continuing to uphold competition, openness, transparency, and the rule of law. The president has called for far-reaching reforms to the UN Security Council to expand the number of members. He is aware that actually a lot of countries outside of the collective West understand that the system that the US has built, this so-called rules-based order, is inherently unfair, and it disproportionately gives more power and resources to Europe and North America, and B, it's whenever that system starts to produce a bit more of positive outcome for the global South, the United States undermines it itself. I mean, why is the World Trade Organization currently not working? It's because the United States refuses to nominate a judge to the appellate body, which means that the body where the final, it's like kind of the Supreme Court of the WTO is not functioning. It cannot, because it doesn't have enough judges, which means that as soon as you bring a case to the WTO that, you know, unfair competition and so on was going on, this case cannot move forward to get a final verdict, which is absolutely awesome, because at the moment it's the United States that is breaking the rules of the WTO, the very rules that it installed itself in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, right? When free trade was still perceived as the end of all the troubles for the US and expanding US power because it enriched the country. But now that the WTO could be used against the United States, against these CHIPS Act and these protectionist measures, now they destroy that institution that would actually have a little bit of power over coercing the United States in changing course. And other countries see that, but of course, and I know that he knows that, this must be absolutely clear to him. So this paragraph here, this passage is again kind of an excuse for why they're doing what they're doing, and pretending, virtue signaling, we're trying to make it better, we are trying to fix the things that broke by themselves. The WTO did not break because we're not nominating a judge to the appellate body. The WTO is just not working very well. You know, it's like a wristwatch that kind of, you know, it's just a little bit broken. So now we're trying to fix it. Just like this UN Security Council. Of course, the United States has the idea of putting Japan and Germany into the Security Council. That's their that would be their approach of like increasing the number of countries that agree with them, and Russia and China will do a hell to play along with that. But then the United States is just going to blame those countries for obstructing constructive change and stuff like that. So okay, this is good old. This is just a spiel. President Biden was determined to adapt. He ended U.S. involvement in the war in Afghanistan. So in this passage, he tries to tell us how far-sighted Joe Biden is, and by Joe Biden he always means himself. This transition was unique, unquestionably painful, especially for the people of Afghanistan. You know what would have made the transition less painful? It would have been less painful had you not then taken away like $8 billion or so US dollars from the Afghan central bank and put sanctions on Afghanistan in order to basically create a large-scale hunger and a really a horrible humanitarian situation, because that's all these neocons can think about, right? As soon as somebody doesn't follow along, you try to make the population suffer as much as possible, because in their minds that will then lead the population to rise up against their oppressors and then change the system. And well, you know what, one of those color revolutions will then take place, although like indigenous ones. So okay, this just gets me angry, because the fighting for 20 years against the Taliban just for the Taliban to come back is bad enough, but then making the general population suffer even more. And obviously these goddamn sanctions never make a population rise up against their regimes. They only galvanize support for the regime, because the regime can say, look at what they're doing to us, and they're doing it. I mean, the current strangulation of the Afghan economy and the hunger that it causes is absolutely horrible. But this is part of the plan, and it's part of the plan of the people who write about this. But that's not even the point of this passage. The point of the passage is that he then immediately switches over to Ukraine. but it was a necessary. So the withdrawal from Afghanistan was actually painful but far-sighted, because it was necessary for preparing the US military for the challenges ahead. One of those challenges came even more quickly than we had anticipated with Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. This is quite something, because he basically admits that the reason they withdrew from Afghanistan was not to end the war in Afghanistan. It was to free up resources for other conflicts, which is exactly what people were wondering or worried about when this withdrawal happened. Because again, these neocons, they don't care about human lives. They don't care about the lives of soldiers, because soldiers are only like peasants anyhow, like poor peasants that you can send into their deaths if you wish to do so. So that's not the problem. The issue is, when you withdraw from one theater, is you probably want to open other fronts, which is why we need to be so worried that the United States at the moment is obviously trying to withdraw from Ukraine, its support little by little, because that means one thing and one thing only, that they want to use the resources in another theater. And here he's basically admitting to that. He's trying to sell it just through this idea that it was a far-sighted move, and that again, that this new war in Ukraine was put as a burden on the shoulders of the United States by an outside force, when in fact anyone who could look at this escalatory spiral that Ukraine was already going through, and how it had been pushed into this corner that it was in 21 and 22, could guess that this might be one of the new theaters. I believe that these people don't always know where the next theater is going to be, but that they're going to open the next theater and the next front, that's pretty clear whenever they withdraw from somewhere. This disciplined approach frees up resources for other global priorities, reduces the risk of new Middle East conflicts, and ensures that U.S. interests are protected on a far more sustainable basis. So he's talking about the Middle East now, and I'm not entirely sure. I suppose that he wrote the majority of this essay, and I suppose he wrote it himself or with his team. He wrote the majority of this probably in September, early October, before the uprising, because Sullivan is also the guy who's so notorious for like saying, we solved the Middle East. The Middle East is very stable. Everything is fine. Just basically 2 or 3 weeks before October 7th, right? And that really showed that he doesn't have that much foresight. He just has a lot of ideology build up around himself. So the entire passage then dealing with the Middle East is surprisingly short, which I suppose that Jay just inserted later on, after already submitting the essay to Foreign Affairs, and when everything happened, they just hastily put together a little bit of something to say like, okay, we've not forgot about Israel completely. The Israeli-Palestinian situation is tense, particularly in the West Bank, but in the face of serious frictions, we have de-escalated the crisis in Gaza and restored direct diplomacy between the parties after years of its absence. I seriously think he wrote this in the first 1 or 2 weeks or so of what was going on, and was just trying to kind of not look like a complete fool, because this is obviously not what's going on. But I think there's a timing issue here, and they didn't have enough time also to work out the phraseology of what the approach is going to be. So he tried to stay very cautious on this one. Back to Ukraine, our approach in Ukraine is sustainable. Okay. And contrary to those who say otherwise, it enhances the United States' capacity to meet every contingency in the Indo-Pacific. The American people know a bully when they see one. Yeah, when they look in the mirror. They understand that if they were to pull US support from Ukraine, it would not just put Ukrainians at a severe disadvantage as they defend themselves, but also a terrible precedent. So I think here he's more trying to kind of rub in again the narrative right around Ukraine, and this kind of keep on going, just don't give up. We know that everything is bad. We are aware of it, that this thing is basically lost, but for the sake of it, we keep saying that this must go on, because I'm pretty sure that they already have a narrative ready for when Ukraine is going to fall, of how then to explain to the general public that that after sending all of these billions of dollars to Ukraine, that was not only in vain, but now you're going to have to put sanctions on Ukraine once a Russia-friendly regime will come to power, or once Russia takes over. But that, because then they will do to Ukraine exactly what they did to Afghanistan. They will put sanctions, right? And then you need to explain to them that, oh, look, we told you like way back that this is horrible as a precedent, and blah, blah, blah. And now we have to do all of these horrible things, but it is really necessary because, as we told you, the precedent. We are often asked about the end of US competition with China, which is a really good question. We expect China to remain a major player on the world stage for the foreseeable future. I was wondering about this for a long time. Do they have an end game in mind with in regard to China? I mean, just having a war with it is not an end game. I mean, what's going to come next? But here he says, that they are expecting China to stick around. We seek a free, open, prosperous, and secure international order, one that protects the interests of the United States and its friends and diverse global public goods. But we do not expect a transformative end state like the one that resulted from the collapse of the Soviet Union. So basically saying that the Soviet Union splitting up, that was a grand end game goal, and that solved all the US problems in the Cold War, which it kind of did, But for China, he obviously sees it differently. I do think that, he might be lying, right? He might actually want to have a war and break China up, and this might just be a lie. But since he states this so clearly, and these sentences carry political risk, right? I mean, because there are people who will oppose this view, who will say like, no, we need to break up China. We need to make many little countries out of it. And he seems to indicate that he's not on board with that kind of thinking. So this neocon seems to look at China differently from Russia, right? Russia, he still wants to defeat, and he says Russia must win, and he definitely doesn't look at Russia on the same level as China. So China is kind of, in his world, a bigger player, a more serious player, and one that the US needs to get along with. We will make no apology in pushing back on unfair trade practices that harm American workers. After telling the entire world that they cannot protect their workers, right? Because that would be unfair competition, neoliberalism. Against this backdrop, we seek to de-risk and diversify, not decouple. Interesting. So all the protectionism that has been going on, and the way that China has been slapped with tariffs and whatnot, is de-risking, not decoupling. Okay, we have faced criticism from various quarters that these steps are mercantilist or protectionist, which they are. Yes, they are. This is untrue. No, it's not. These are steps taken in partnership with others and focused on a narrow set of technologies, steps that the United States needs to take in a more contested world to protect its national security while supporting an interconnected global economy. So again, national security is right there because it can override neoliberal dogma. So I think we can rightfully conclude that Sullivan is a very hard realist who sees the economy as serving the military state and the war-making capacity of the United States. But Washington and Beijing need to figure out how to manage competition to reduce tension and find a way forward to share challenges. This is why the Biden administration is intensifying U.S. diplomacy with China. This could either be a lie, either he wants actually to have a war and just doesn't want to say so yet, or he actually belongs to the group of neocons who wants to avoid direct confrontation with China. I can't tell. We should also remember that not everything competitors do is incompatible with US interests. The deal that China brokered this year between Iran and Saudi Arabia partially reduced tensions between those two countries, a development that the United States also wanted to see. I find this interesting because the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia is generally looked at as a fiasco for US diplomacy, because it wasn't the US that was able to implement this, it was China. And Sullivan here actually, he kind of nods to the Chinese, saying like, respect, kind of tip to the hat, right? kind of situation, which is surprising. You don't get that very often. Tells me that maybe he's actually serious about not wanting a war with China, because he seems to respect them a little bit. This is a sign of respect that he gives them here. And then, very pertinent to this channel, actually, it is only natural that countries aligned with neither the United States nor China will engage with both, seeking to benefit from the competition while endeavoring to protect their own interests from any spillover effects. Many of these countries see themselves as part of the global South, a grouping that has a logic of its own and is distinct critique of the West that dates back to the Cold War and the founding of the non-aligned movement. Here he speaks about these third states that don't want to go along, again, like India in many respects, Asia, Africa, South America, and he acknowledges that they exist. And his prescription toward neutral and non-aligned countries is that Washington should be realistic about its expectations when dealing with these countries, respecting their sovereignty and their right to make decisions that advance their own interests. But it also needs to be clear about what is most important to the United States, that is, how we will seek to shape relations with them, so that on balance, they have incentives to act in ways consistent with US interests. This passage really says nothing else, but we're going to use the stick and the carrot, right? We understand that they don't always want to do the same thing that we want because it's in their interest, but we don't give too much of a damn. I mean, either they take the carrot or they get the stick, but it needs to be coherent with US interests. So overall, this guy is a neocon realist who understands the world in hard power terms. And neutral and non-aligned countries have nothing good to expect from this administration or from people connected to this guy, unless it's also in the interest of the United States. And at the very end, we go to his final words. The United States now finds itself at the start of the third era, one in which it is adjusting for a new period of competition in an age of interdependence and transnational challenges. So he seems to not want to break up the world into different pieces, but he acknowledges that the world economy actually is intertwined, and that this is going to stay a feature of this new balance of power, a balance of power with overlapping spheres and economies of interest. The outcome of this phase will not be determined solely by outside forces. It will also, to a large extent, be decided by the United States' own choices, playing right into what Zakaria then says in January, that the greatest threat that he sees is that the US electorate votes wrongly and doesn't re-elect neocons like him, but people with a different vision and a different analysis of what the problems of the country are. This reading to me was quite interesting. Tells me that Sullivan actually doesn't believe all of the talking points and the lies, that he probably makes them and he knows how to make them and formulate them, but he himself views the world very much in great power terms. So probably he's somebody who can be bargained with. The question then is, how many of his kind are in the current administration? How many people actually believe what he says? We don't know, but we'll keep watching. Thank you.